Fr Seraphim Rose and 21st-century science. That is the title of an introduction written by Phillip E. Johnson for Fr Seraphim Rose's book titled Genesis, Creation and Early Man. Despite the title of Phillip Johnson's introduction, there is no real connection between Fr Seraphim Rose and 21st-century science, as Fr Seraphim Rose was not a scientist. Fr Seraphim Rose was a former Methodist Christian who had studied Chinese literature. He later converted to Orthodox Christianity and lived as a monk. Following his death, a fellow American monk gathered some of his writings on Bible literalism and creationism and published them in the form of a book. Phillip E. Johnson, who wrote the introduction to the book, is neither an Orthodox Christian nor a scientist, rather an American legal scholar and apologist for American religious fundamentalism. According to Wikipedia, he was an opponent of the theory of evolution. He was co-founder of the so-called Discovery Institute's Center for Science and Culture and one of the co-founders of the Intelligent Design movement. The Discovery Institute's claim to science is misleading, as the Institute does not carry out any scientific research, nor is it an accredited educational establishment. It is essentially an office in Seattle, Oregon, but claims to have a long list of fellows and organizes occasional talks on creationism and Bible literalism. We learn from Phillip E. Johnson that Seraphim Rose's writings were in response to a 48-page letter he had received from a Greek medical doctor, Alexander Kalomiros. Dr. Kalomiros had written 3 books in which he was arguing, among else, how Orthodox Christian belief differs from Western Christianity, especially criticizing the rise of religious fundamentalism in America. Phillip E. Johnson appears to have read the letter of Alexander Kalomiros, which unfortunately has not been published. Phillip Johnson claims that the book was written so that Orthodox believers would not be misled by misguided efforts to reinterpret those teachings in the light of modernist evolutionary science. Apart from the bizarre claim that the American converts to Orthodoxy were being misled by the Orthodox Church, he proceeds into a long diatribe about creationism in which he rejects all claims made by the actual scientific community, invents his own theory about how life appeared, and makes frequent assertions about things that are not true, claiming disagreements between certain scientists, missing evidence, and so on. He also proposes a new theology in which he claims that true knowledge of life's origin can only come from revelation, as described in the book of Genesis. That those events took place literally in 6 days, according to laws that are no longer true, but were true at the time before the fall of Adam. Unfortunately for his literalist argument, there is no literal statement in the Old Testament that the laws of nature have changed. The Bible says instead that creation was through Logos, and presumably Logos has not changed, or else we have 2 different gods in the Bible. The idea that the laws have changed is his idea, a common habit among American Protestants, each one of whom apparently thinks they are the only person who interprets correctly the Old Testament. Another idea of Phillip E. Johnson is that God created the world as described in the book of Genesis using an intelligent design, much more intelligent than the process of evolution, presumably involving God drawing up gene designs in a heavenly workshop. Phillip E. Johnson then criticizes biology for insisting on what he calls uniformitarianism. he asks that the theory of evolution must be discarded because it contradicts his theory. Johnson tells us he will undertake to examine the questions of the theory of evolution in his introduction to the book, believing himself to be an expert on the topic, despite not having any scientific credentials, and while the scientific community believed him to be ignorant, misleading, and intellectually dishonest, with multiple publications and editorials in scientific journals published specifically to warn policymakers against Johnson's unscientific arguments. Among his unscientific claims were that HIV was not the cause of AIDS, and that scientific evidence has been exaggerated to make such a claim. The theory of evolution is one of the oldest scientific theories. It was first proposed by two philosophers of the school of Miletus in the 6th and early 5th century before Christ, Thales and Anaximander. Thales had also made the first recorded observations of static electricity and magnetism. St. Hippolytus of Rome quotes Anaximander as having proposed man's ultimate descent from fish. His mentor, Thales the Milesian, had proposed that logos, that is reason, is behind all phenomena. It was argued that life must have begun in water, as water is essential for all living beings. Anaximander had also said that the world had emerged from the infinite, or unknown. This is indeed also the Orthodox view, and St. Hippolytus does not challenge this assertion when he says near the conclusion of his book Against Heresies that the followers, however, of Hippasus and Anaximander and Thales the Milesian are disposed to think that all things have been generated from one, an entity, endued with quality. The theory of the evolution of life was further developed by Empedocles, Aristotle, Theophrastus, and many others, including the Roman philosopher Lucretius, who had proposed that chance variation of traits provided the possibility for the evolution of new species. Charles Darwin acknowledged the origin of the theory in classical antiquity, adding to it his own proposal that natural selection through the survival of the fittest was the process by which variations of traits can be passed on to the next generation, potentially leading to the evolution of new species. It is unclear whether Johnson was aware of the old history of the theory, which the saints had never in their writings rejected in favor of other ideas, such as creationism. It would have been much better if Damascene, the fellow monk of Fr Seraphim Rose, had never attempted to publish this book that is a disservice to Orthodox Christianity. Johnson proceeds by presenting a definition of the word evolution as presented in a policy statement of the National Association of Biology Teachers of the United States of America. The diversity of life on Earth is the outcome of evolution, an unsupervised, impersonal, unpredictable, and natural process of temporal descent with genetic modification that is affected by natural selection, chance, historical contingencies, and changing environments. In Orthodox thought, natural processes are due to God, and saying that a natural process is responsible for the variability of life on Earth does not exclude God. Secondly, according to this definition, natural selection is not due to chance. Natural selection depends on prevailing environmental conditions, which are at any point in time and place a given. The natural conditions have developed according to natural laws and are therefore not random. Their influence on evolution is causal, the exact opposite of random. Moreover, evolution does not only act on random mutations, but also on existing genetic diversity within a species. Johnson does not like the part about unpredictable and random, which contradicts his theory of intelligent design, and says, "A human embryo never grows into some animal other than a human being, and an acorn never turns aside from its programmed path to become a pine tree or a rose bush. An ape never gives birth to a human, or vice versa. And it is still more unthinkable that a bacterium would give birth to a butterfly." The term random, with reference to that statement, implies random genetic changes in the genetic sequence caused by random mutations. Single mutations will not, of course, change a bacterium into a butterfly or a human into a non-human primate. Perhaps that is the level of understanding of biology by Philip Johnson. He clearly does not understand what a species is. He then argues that the changes caused by mutations are small and back and forth, and he also claims that according to science, evolution is undirected, which is not a statement made in the definition of evolution by the National Association of Biology Teachers he has quoted. The statement says unsupervised, not undirected. Evolution is directed by natural laws. Evolution is not supervised. His opinion that evolution could not lead to new species is not shared by any actual scientists. The majority of Christians outside America find no reason to disregard the theory of evolution. Even the Patriarch of Constantinople had written a lengthy letter to Charles Darwin after the publication of his Origin of the Species to congratulate him for his compelling theory, objecting only on the evolution of man possessing logos from non-human primates which do not have speech. Charles Darwin later wrote a second book titled The Descent of Man, where he attempted to address this specific question. Numerous new books have recently been published in Russia that criticize the theory of evolution. For the most part, these are the translated works of American Protestant creationists. Orthodoxy has neither a textual nor a doctrinal basis to reject evolutionism. Neither does it make sense for Orthodox Christians to indulge the current fashion of irrationality, since any irrationality, in the end, will favor occultism and will work against the Church. Before beginning, it should be said that it is more a novelty than a tradition among the Orthodox to disclaim evolution. That is a quote from Father Andrei Kureyev, a Christian Orthodox theologian, from his essay on Orthodoxy in Science. And another quote of his: "The problem has to be framed in its basically Anglo-American context. I have never before had this with Russian Orthodox people from Russia. Most Russians have no difficulty in reconciling their biology classes with their orthodoxy." From another essay called Orthodoxy and Evolution. Having grown up in Athens, Greece, that was also my own experience and my understanding that it is the situation not only in Russia and Greece, but also in the rest of the Orthodox world, at least outside America. Fr Seraphim Rose makes an error of confusing Bible literalism with understanding the Bible according to Christian belief. These are two diametrically opposed views that Fr Seraphim Rose fails to appreciate in his writings and which he fails to disentangle from one another. I will clarify this point in the future. On this occasion, I will cover the principles of the theory of evolution and why there are no other theoretical alternatives ever proposed, excluding the ridiculous ideas of religious fundamentalists. The idea of evolution is that life evolved according to natural processes on the basis of adaptive changes to the natural environment. These changes acted on the genome to affect the fitness of individuals for survival. The substrate of evolution and speciation is the genetic variability existing in the population of a species. Some of that genetic variability has been caused by random mutations at some point in life's history. The majority of genetic variability at any time, however, is due to different environmental pressures favoring certain gene variants over others depending on location and conditions. Different species can evolve dependent on the variability in the natural environment and the way it changes over time. The process is causal, such that a gene has an outcome, and the outcome is a lesser or greater adaptability of the organism to its environment. Therefore, the process is natural, causal, and logical. Environments on Earth have changed greatly from a time when there was no oxygen at all to temporary extremes when up to about 38% of the Earth's atmosphere consisted of oxygen. Temperature fluctuations have also varied from an average of about 10 degrees centigrade to 35 degrees centigrade, but of course there were at any time also local temperature variations depending on local environments. All species of organisms that had evolved 500 million years ago have become extinct because the environments they were adapted to no longer exist. Indeed, their successors and their successors' successors have also become extinct. The species present on Earth today are all recently evolved from previous species. A species is defined as a type of organism, individuals of which can either sexually or asexually produce viable offspring, but which are genetically isolated from other organisms, interbreeding with which results in infertile or non-viable offspring. There is insurmountable evidence of evolution of new species before our very eyes from specific, well-studied examples in our own time. One such example is the appearance of the novel, human-specific SARS-CoV-2 coronavirus, the cause of the COVID-19 pandemic of 2020. That virus did not previously exist. It was a newly evolved virus. All of us have witnessed its first appearance. The new virus underwent subsequent evolution, with early forms becoming extinct due to the genetic drift and ecological isolation. I offer this one well-known example for now, but there are numerous well-documented studies in the last few decades of the evolution of dozens of new species of viruses, bacteria, algae, yeast, fungi, plants, and animals, including vertebrates, either following controlled experiments or observed in nature. One question troubling religiously minded individuals is that only humans have logos, at least in the sense of speech, and that humans are therefore special and could not have evolved from other species. Humans belong to the family of hominids, which includes other primates. That does not mean that humans have evolved from present monkeys, but from a primate lineage that was more human-like, but which now has only one surviving species, that of Homo sapiens. Other species of that lineage have become extinct. One of the most unique characteristics of humans is logos, that allows humans alone, among all animals, to have a complex language and the ability to store and transmit vast amounts of knowledge through social means, through books and oral transmission, means not available to other animals. The unique capacity for reason and knowledge is what makes humans able to compose literature, art, build bridges, ships, automobiles, satellites, and space stations, develop mathematics and physics, produce novel vaccines and novel antibiotics in factories that can be distributed worldwide in a very short time. In these respects, laymen and scientists, atheists and religiously minded individuals all around the earth agree that humans are unlike any other form of life on earth. What has made humans so different from other living forms? Compared to other animals, primates have a very highly developed body language with which they can communicate with the other members of their species. They have a brain area specialized for the production of vocalizations, these being limited to the equivalence of human exclamations, such as the pleasant surprise indicated by the exclamation of ah or oh, called a coo in macaque monkeys, or the threatening exclamation eh, called a grunt or bark in macaques, depending on its intensity. Macaque monkeys can produce several other types of vocal signs, including alarm calls, greeting calls, the silent laugh, a baby laugh of young macaques, and so on. These vocalizations are produced by parts of the brain responsible for the movement of the mouth and tongue. However, in macaques, the motor areas of the brain do not control the larynx to the same extent as in humans, so their vocalizations are simple, short, and stereotyped. More complex vocalizations, however, are a question of degrees, something evolution can achieve. Another brain area that has to do with the production of language in humans is the so-called Wernicke's area. This area is important in the conceptual understanding of language, including syntax, as opposed to producing vocalizations. Primates use that part of their brain for the understanding of social signals, for example, produced using face expressions and body postures. It is a very large area, as primates have a very complex repertoire of facial expressions, gestures, and body postures. An innovation of the human brain is a strong bidirectional neuronal connectivity between the areas producing vocalizations with Wernicke's area responsible for semantic meaning. These connections between sound and semantic meaning are insufficiently developed in primates, although some weak connections exist. So the essential machinery for the evolution of language is present in primates, and the potentiality for the evolution of language is always present. Humans happen to be the first species to actually develop the existing circuitry further and evolve a highly complex spoken language. Nonetheless, evolution has achieved far greater changes in brain structure across species than the development of such new neuronal connections. Johnson goes into a discussion of the idea that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. The proposal of Ernst Haeckel from 1866 was that the embryonic forms resemble adults of other species. That, of course, is not quite correct. Nonetheless, what has been observed since the 18th century is that the fertilized egg appears during its development to go through the successive stages of the evolution of life from a unicellular organism to multicellular, developing next an internal cavity, developing bilateral symmetry, then segmentation appears in the embryo, again emulating the next stage in the evolution of vertebrates, following which more differentiated organs begin to appear. There is no opposition in the scientific community to the idea that the developing embryo recapitulates the stages of evolution. Johnson handwaves the idea away and does not say how these observations should be explained in his mind, according to some theory he may have devised while rejecting evolution. Johnson calls this observation a persistent legend of evolutionists, as if it was an ancient myth or fairy tale rather than an observation established already 2 centuries ago. Some animals, such as sponges and other invertebrates, for example, cnidaria, sea stars, sea urchins, mussels, and the like, have no bilateral symmetry. Sponges do not have much of a symmetry at all. They develop into a blastula, then usually proliferate in a quasi-regular manner to produce bigger multicellular organisms. The basic plan of a multicellular animal up to the emergence of a segmented body and bilateral symmetry is present in all animals. That is, in the embryos of all animals. More advanced animals have a segmented body with bilateral symmetry, and early vertebrates also had fins below and above the body. These types of animals are extinct except for the so-called ammocetes, free-living embryonic forms of a primitive-looking fish known as a sea lamprey, a fish without teeth, which, once mature, lives as an ectoparasite on other fishes. From that point onward, the evolution of vertebrates has taken a distinct direction, but it is hardly accidental that up to that point, all animals with bilateral symmetry shared a commonality in the development of their embryos, which development recapitulated the stages of their evolution. Modern animals have gone through other evolutionary adaptations, such as the development of encephalization, a vertebral column, gills and lungs, and the evolution of a placenta from reptiles onward, among much else. These evolutionary changes are traced in their embryos, and it can be hardly accidental that embryos of fish, reptiles, amphibians, and mammals resemble each other until the unique characteristics of the phylum need to develop, at which point the embryonic forms begin to diverge in appearance. Phillip E. Johnson makes the argument that according to the theory of evolution, of course that's his imagination, if an embryo was stopped halfway through its development when it looks, let's say, like an amphibian, then it should mature into an amphibian. And that is ridiculous, of course. No one says it should, because the genetic material is there, except if you would assume, as Phillip E. Johnson does, that genes do not obey the laws of nature, or really any laws. That is one of his ideas, that genes are not serving anymore any purpose. They're there as a remnant of a previous time. Phillip E. Johnson instead argues that by saying that genes do not follow the present laws of nature and cannot cause the evolution of organisms, that they are a useless remnant of God's original intelligent design. Presumably, logos and causality may act on other molecules and chemical reactions, but causality and the laws of nature may not act on DNA and RNA to change anything, to cause genetic variability, to cause evolution and speciation. Of course, that is ridiculous. Besides, it is well known that genetic changes do change the phenotype of species. They are responsible for the production of proteins, and the scientific literature is filled with hundreds of thousands of studies of how changes in a gene causing a change in a protein as predicted from the gene sequence can change the function of the protein and ultimately adaptation of an organism to its environment. Some genetic changes have such severe consequences that are incompatible with life, which exactly argues that genetic sequences are not random events unaffected by the laws of nature. Perhaps the greatest contribution of a Christian to science was the contribution of the Catholic monk Gregor Mendel, who gave his name to Mendelian genetics after explaining the variability of hybrids on the underlying genetics of their parents. But to return to Johnson's argument about embryos being unable to survive as adults in free nature, that is indeed true in the case of embryos inside an egg. They cannot survive in a free form. Embryos inside a placenta cannot survive free living because an adult would be outside the egg of the placenta. So that is an embryonic form that's incompatible with life as a free living form. But in the case of free living embryos, there are such embryos. There are embryos that live free out in nature, the so-called larval forms of a species, such as insect caterpillars or salamander and frog tadpoles. They can, of course, survive in the free living forms and resemble previous evolutionary stages different from the adult form. For example, a salamander tadpole, its larva, resembles the ammoseed, the larva of a sea lamprey, a type of fish, much more than the adult forms of a sea lamprey with gills and a land-living salamander with lungs and limbs resemble each other. The larval form of the two species also resembles the presumed free-living body form of an ancestral vertebrate species which has been found in fossils. Johnson's critique shows a complete lack of understanding of the science of biology, what a species is in biological terminology, what reproductive isolation means, or what a hybrid is. It is unclear whether Phillip E. Johnson is disingenuous in misinforming and is attempting to mislead, or whether he is simply not competent to discuss biology. In either case, he is not suited to write an introduction to any book dealing with evolution. The editor and author should have found someone in the scientific community who might be knowledgeable in biology and not, of all people, a legal scholar. It is a disservice to Orthodox Christianity to reject the theory of evolution and instead propose a theory that they think is based on Scripture, but assumes things never mentioned in Scripture, such as genes being created according to different laws that no longer apply, or that life could not be created by reason and causality, but had to be created under time constraints in the way a potter or a carpenter works. That kind of thinking only reveals their own limitations and the limitations of the knowledge of the people to whom God has revealed himself in times of great antiquity, before any kind of science had existed. Their limitations are not the limitations of God.